What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Let's Excel Together. If you remember last week, we got into VBA automation. So we discussed how to set up a module and how you can actually get yourself into a position to where you can start writing some VBA code. So if this is your first time here, I'd highly recommend going back, watching that video, then coming back today and watching this one, because we're going to be discussing a little bit more of an advanced topic today, which is VBA for loops. So we're going to be iterating through a range of cells today to accomplish a specific task, and it'll all be done in a blink of an eye. So let's go ahead and get started. Remember, if you didn't watch last week's video, go back, watch it, come back to this one. Let's get started. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing for loops today. So if you remember in the previous video, we got to this position where we were able to set up a module, we were able to set up a subroutine where we wanted to write some VBA code. So I'm not going to cover that. We're going to get right into what I ended off with on the last video. So we're going to start our subroutine with the word sub, as I mentioned before. So sub, we'll just call it for loop, because that's what we're going to be discussing today. And we press enter, and it's going to end our sub. Perfect. So again, I'm not going to cover into detail too much about what I covered last week, but I'll go ahead and talk it through. So the first thing we need to do is dim the variables of our workbook and our sheet that we're interested in working with. So we're going to call this dim practice workbook as workbook. We're going to say dim practice sheet as worksheet. And then we're going to go ahead and set those two variables. So set practice workbook equal to workbooks application dot this workbook dot name. Okay, so we set that variable. Now we're going to set the sheet. So we're going to say set practice sheet equal to the practice workbook dot worksheets and the sheet 1 that we're working in currently right now. So sheet 1. Perfect. Okay, so now we have our variables defined, our variables set, and we're going to go ahead and get into what a for loop is. So essentially what a for loop does is it loops through an iteration and accomplishes a block of code that you want to be executed. So let's say, for example, we wanted to write the number 10 in the first 500 rows of this workbook. Now, we could say, okay, well, we could just go here, we could take this 10, and we can copy it down all the way till we get to 500, which it wouldn't take long, but now imagine we had to do that for 5,000, or we had to do that for 50,000. It might take a little longer. So, with a for loop, we can accomplish this in a blink of an eye. So we're going to go ahead and set this up. So for a for loop, it starts with what you might think, the word for. So we're going to say for, and then we're going to say x, which is our variable, which is going to determine the iteration that we're currently in, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. So for x equals to, this next part is where we want to start the for loop. So we want to start in row 1. So we're going to say for x equals 1, 2, and I said before, let's do 500. Like I said, we could do 5,000, 50,000, whatever. But for today's example, we're going to do 500. So for x equals 1 to 500, and then we have to end our for loop with the word next x. So essentially, what's going to happen is when the code execution gets to here, it's going to execute all the code that we write inside of this block. And then once it gets back to here, it's going to go back up to the next iteration of the for loop. So x will then become 2. And then on the next iteration, x will become 3, and so on and so forth until we get to 500. And then it will get to this next x, and then it will leave the for loop and continue on with the macro. Okay? So what do we want to accomplish inside of this for loop? We're going to simply just write a number to the cell. So we're just going to write the number, I don't know, 10. Let's write the number 10. So we're going to say, okay, so practice sheet dot range a, and then what we need to do is concatenate the number that the iteration of the for loop that we're in to this value. So we need to say and x, which is this variable here, the iteration that we're currently in. We're going to close the parentheses, dot value equals, and we'll just do 10, for example. Perfect. So what this says is in practice sheet, which we defined up here, in range column A, And in the first iteration, this is going to be a 1. So this is essentially A1, okay? So practice sheet A1.value equals 10. So once this line executes, it's going to go down here and then go back up to the beginning of the for loop. This x is going to increment by 1. Okay, so now it's going to become 2. So this x becomes 2. So then it's going to be practice sheet dot range A2 dot value equals 10. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and execute this code real quick, and then I'm going to come back and explain something that's very important to help debug for loops and other bits of VBA code. So as mentioned before, hitting this little play button will execute your code. So we have our cursor in here, we'll hit play, and bam, without even seeing it, went all the way down to row 500 and put the number 10 in there. Okay, so very quick, lightning fast, as opposed to writing, like I said before, writing the 10 in here, copying it down. You know, it's much quicker to do this. So what I wanted to also mention is stepping through your code. And what this means is you can execute each line of code one by one so that you can debug or look at a variable's value before it actually executes. So in order to do that, you need to press F8 on your keyboard. So for me, I have this little keyboard here. F8 on the keyboard. Okay, we're going to do F8, and you'll see what it does is it creates this little yellow arrow, and it highlights the line that you're on. So if I press F8, it's going to go to the next one, and it's going to go to the next one. Okay, so now we are inside of our for loop. So if we hover over this X, you can see that it's defined as X equals 1 because we're in the very first iteration of the for loop, right? So if I press F8 on this line, it's going to execute. So if you look over here on A1, you'll see, bam, as soon as I executed this line, it writes that value in there. If I press F8 again, it's going to go to the next X, which is going to set the X value to 2 now because we're on the second iteration. So if I keep stepping through this by pressing F8, you can see the code actually working itself and see what's actually happening right in front of your eyes. So a very nifty way to learn what the code is doing, 1. And 2, if you ever run into an issue in the future where you have a bug or something that you can't quite figure out, you can step through this line by line by line and figure out what your variables are, maybe where the error is occurring, and so on and so forth. So obviously I'm not going to do this 500 times. So if you're happy with it, what you can do is just press this play button, and bam, it'll finish your for loop there. So very simple, very easy to set up, very basic for loop. So that's pretty much it, you guys. That's the for loop. Obviously, this is a very basic example. In the future, we're going to get into some very complex, a lot more involved with either functions. We could combine some if statements in here. We could do nested for loops where we could even write another for loop inside of this one to accomplish some other task. So that's an option. But for now, we're going to stick with what we've learned today here. Take this, practice it, apply it if you can to your job, to your hobby, to a project that you're working on. And hopefully, this was a little bit of help to you guys. And we'll see you next week. See ya.